The widow, penniless and without resources, inherited a closed mine that everyone considered unproductive in the middle of the dry mountainous area. However, when she managed to tear down the wooden planks blocking the entrance, what she discovered under the stone transformed her life permanently. Share with us in the comments what town are you tuning in from. Click the like button and let's continue with the story. The desert wind raised reddish dust over the few attendees surrounding the freshly opened grave. Elena Vargas, 32 years old, had buried her husband moments earlier under the merciless New Mexico sun. 3 weeks earlier, Tomas had died in a collapse at the San Rafael mine. He was buried by tons of stone in his search for the silver vein that would have secured their future. Now, Elena was completely alone. Dressed in mourning under suffocating heat, she heard Father Domingo's rapid phrases while the neighbor women avoided her gaze. 2 days after the burial, banker Cornelius Blackwell showed up at her home with documents and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Tomas had requested a $300 loan for mining tools. After applying interest, the debt amounted to $500. Elena had until the end of the month to pay it off or lose the small ranch that had been her home for 5 years. Mrs. Vargas, I understand your situation, said Blackwell, while adjusting his glasses, standing on the porch. He hadn't even invited her to sit down. However, business is business. Your deceased husband signed some very precise documents. Elena tried to argue that she had no funds and that Tomas had invested everything in explosives and tools. Blackwell, without further ado, folded the documents and put on his hat. Then I recommend you find a solution quickly. There are interested buyers for this land. Sheriff Morrison was even harsher when Elena, desperate, turned to him and explained that the debt seemed to increase every week in an unbelievable way. The official barely looked up from his desk. Ma'am, if your husband put his signature on those papers, there is nothing I can do. Financial obligations are transferred. That's how the law works. Yet, $500 for a $300 credit in only 6 months? Finally, Morrison looked at her sternly. If you can't pay off the debt, sell the ranch and leave. In this region, there are many widowed women. It's not my responsibility to solve each one's financial affairs. The town's lawyer, a thin man named Pearson, charged her $2 just to handle her case. After examining the paperwork Elena had obtained from Blackwell, he let out a deep sigh. The terms are abusive, no doubt, although from a technical point of view, they comply with regulations. And Mrs. Vargas, he paused awkwardly, you are a woman without means or male support. Facing Mr. Blackwell in court would be expensive and, in all likelihood, unsuccessful. Therefore, there is nothing I can do. I suggest you accept any offer for the property and start your life over elsewhere, perhaps with relatives, but Elena had no family. Her parents had died of fever when she was 17. Tomas was her entire universe, and now that universe was crumbling like the walls of the mine that killed him. The local neighbor women, who once greeted her at church, now crossed the street when they saw her approaching. A widowed and helpless woman was an uncomfortable reminder of how fragile everyone's stability was, and no one wanted that bad luck near them. In the following days, Elena sold off the few valuable objects she owned. Tomas had gathered his pocket watch, tools, and the living room furniture. He barely managed to scrape together $120, less than a quarter of his debt. On the eve of the deadline, Elena sat on the empty porch of her ranch. She gazed at the horizon, where the silhouettes of the mountains stood out against the violet sky of twilight. Until then, she had complied with social norms. She was a submissive woman, a loyal wife, always asking for permission, always needing the protection of a man. Now, that system discarded her mercilessly. At that moment, she recalled Tomas's final words, uttered breathlessly on his deathbed. Grandfather's mine, in the Valley of the Crosses, now belongs to you. I never managed to open it, but it's yours. Elena had almost completely forgotten about that property. Tomas's grandfather, a miner by trade, worked in the northern mountains in a remote valley where few people ventured until his death. The modest mining claim passed to Tomas, who never exploited it. It sealed, the old man once told him, and blocked the entrance before he died. He claimed the mine was ill-fated, that it had taken too much from him. However, at that moment, as the darkness deepened, Elena pondered a sealed mine in the vastness of the desert. It was more than she would have the next day when Blackwell came to confiscate the ranch. At dawn the next day, before the banker's arrival, Elena loaded 2 saddlebags with basic items. She included blankets, matches, Tomas's old rifle with a box of ammunition, stale bread, jerky, and a canteen. She pinned a note on the ranch door, "Keep this land, I'm leaving." She saddled the old mare that, by miracle, hadn't been sold and set off northward, toward the mountains where, they said, Tomas's grandfather's mine was located. The journey would take 3 days through dry, uninhabited terrain, but Elena had nothing to lose. The first day she rode under a blazing sun that pounded her skull. The next day the surroundings became rockier, with reddish stones rising like ancient cathedrals. She saw no human being, only lizards, vultures circling overhead, and occasionally the whitish skeleton of some beast that couldn't complete the route. On the third day, guided by the vague directions Tomas had given her at the time, Elena came upon the valley, a narrow canyon between 2 rock walls. In the distance, she saw the half-ruined wooden structure, the old camp of the miner grandfather. The mine was beyond. A dark hole in the cliff, sealed with sturdy planks that the years had eroded but not toppled. Elena dismounted, her legs trembling after the days of riding. She gazed at the sealed entrance, dark and intimidating. That was her future. An abandoned mine in the wilderness, supposedly ill-fated, perhaps devoid of riches, but it was hers and it was a start. The path to the mine's entrance was dangerous, strewn with loose stones and cracks hidden under the sand. Elena moved cautiously, holding the mare's reins with one hand while inspecting the ground. At each step, dust rose and clung to her black dress, turning it a reddish gray. The wooden structure she had seen in the distance was larger than she imagined. It was a modest one-room shack with a partially collapsed ceiling. The windows had long lost their glass, replaced by poorly nailed planks. The door hung from a single hinge, creating a dark opening that resembled a mouth. Elena stood before the shack, her heart pounding. Inside, there might be rattlesnakes, black widows, or something more sinister, but night was approaching, and she needed shelter. She tied the mare to a post that, miraculously, still stood upright and pulled the rifle from the saddle. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked that it was loaded. Years ago, Tomas had taught her to shoot, but she had never used the weapon against anything more dangerous than an empty bottle. "If you're going to be afraid," she told herself in a low voice, "at least move forward with fear." She pushed the door with the rifle barrel. The wood groaned but gave way. The twilight light flooded the interior, revealing a place full of dust and cobwebs. Elena blinked to let her eyes adjust to the semi-darkness. The cabin had the essentials: a knocked-over table, a broken chair, empty shelves leaning against a wall. In the corner, there was a wooden cot with a completely rotted mattress, but the main thing was that there were no signs of threatening occupants. Elena advanced slowly, scanning every corner with the rifle. Something moved in the shadows, and she almost shot before realizing it was just a mouse. She exhaled the air she had been holding. In a half-hidden corner among the rubble, she found a valuable object: a wooden chest with a rusty padlock. She dragged it to where there was light. With a blow from the rifle butt, the lock opened, revealing its contents. Moth-eaten blankets, but still usable, a rusty pickaxe, a shovel, and, to her surprise, a second rifle more modern than hers, wrapped in oilcloth, along with a box of ammunition. "It's intact. "Thank you, grandfather," Elena whispered as she took out the weapon. This changed the situation. Having a rifle could mean the difference between living and dying in this abandoned place. She continued inspecting behind the shelves and came across a narrow door that led to an extension of the cabin. It was a basic pantry partly carved into the rock. Inside, she found rusty cans, mostly burst from the passage of time. However, she also found something amazing. A small well carved into the rocky floor with crystal clear water at the bottom. Elena almost cried with relief. The water meant she could stay here, at least for a while. She lowered the canteen tied to a rope that she found in the chest and tasted the water cautiously. The water was fresh and pure, surely supplied by an underground spring. As the sun set completely, Elena worked quickly. She cleared an area on the floor, shook out the least deteriorated blankets, dragged the table, and placed it to partially block the entrance. She lit a small fire in the stone fireplace she found in a corner, using dry wood from the broken furniture. The glow of the fire changed the cabin from a threatening place to an almost cozy one. Elena settled on the floor, eating dried meat and drinking fresh water from the well, experiencing for the first time in weeks a feeling close to hope. However, that hope suddenly shattered. Hearing the sound of horse hooves approaching from outside, Elena froze with the dried meat halfway to her mouth. The hooves stopped next to the cabin, and the voices of deep, hoarse men were heard arguing about something as they moved stealthily. Elena covered the fire with sand, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness. She grabbed the new rifle, checked it was loaded, and positioned herself behind the overturned table next to the entrance. "Smoke is coming out of there," a voice said from outside, "and someone is inside." "Probably just some vagrants," replied another, younger voice. "This place has been uninhabited for decades. Let's go take a look. It could be someone who knows something about the mine." Heavy footsteps approached the door. Elena held the rifle against her shoulder, finger on the trigger, breath held. A figure appeared in the doorway and exclaimed, "Hello, come out of there. We know someone's in there." Elena recognized the intimidation tactic, but remained silent. The individual took a step inside. In the dim light, Elena could make out his bulky silhouette, his wide-brimmed hat, and the gun on his belt. "Last warning," the man announced. "Come out now, or we'll come in by force." Elena cocked the rifle, and the metallic sound echoed in the silence. The man stood still and asked, "Who's there?" "Someone with a Winchester aimed straight at your chest," Elena replied, keeping a firm tone despite the panic she felt. "I suggest you step back." There was a brief moment of stunned silence, after which the man commented, "A woman with excellent aim and zero tolerance for trespassers on her property. This mine is my legitimate property. I'll give you 5 seconds to mount your horses and leave." "Ma'am, we're not looking for trouble," replied another voice from outside. "We're just inspecting the area. We work for Mr. Blackwell." The name hit Elena like a slap. Blackwell, the banker who had taken over her ranch, was now sending men to this place. How had he found her whereabouts so quickly? "I don't care who you work for," Elena declared. "Get out of here right now." The individual in the doorway slowly stepped back. "You're making a mistake, ma'am. Mr. Blackwell has interests in this land. He can make your life very difficult." "He already made it difficult," Elena replied, "and I survived. Now leave before I decide I need to check if this rifle works." To emphasize her warning, Elena fired a shot into the air through the partially collapsed roof. The roar was deafening in the confined space. Outside, the horses neighed in terror. "She's crazy," the young man exclaimed. "Let's go. It's not worth it," said the other. Elena heard hurried footsteps, the creak of saddles, and then the trot of horses fading into the night. She remained still for several minutes, the rifle still aimed at the entrance. Her heart was beating so intensely she could feel it in her ears. Now that the immediate danger had passed, her hands were shaking violently. Finally, she lowered the weapon and slid to the floor, leaning her back against the wall in the absolute darkness of the shack. Elena let the tears flow. They were tears of fear, of relief, of fury against a universe that hounded her, even in this remote corner of the desert. Yet in those tears, there was also something else, an astounding discovery. She had stood up to armed men, had protected what belonged to her, had fired a rifle, not as practice, but with the firm intention of defending herself. All her life, she had been taught that women were weak, that they required male protection, that they were not capable of surviving on their own. Yet here she was, alone in the vastness, having scared off the invaders with nothing but courage and a gun. Perhaps the rules she had been taught were nothing more than convenient lies to keep her vulnerable. Elena wiped away her tears, reloaded the rifle, and prepared for a long night awake. She guarded the entrance to the cabin with the gun on her lap. When dawn finally arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elena remained awake and vigilant. She had survived her first night, and she would survive the next. The following days established an exhausting but essential routine. Elena rose at dawn, took cold water from the well, and began the work of turning the ruined shack into a livable place. First, she mended the roof with wooden planks taken from other dilapidated buildings. Around the mining camp, her hands, soft from years of housework, became covered in blisters that burst and turned into calluses. She acquired the skill of hammering rusty nails without smashing her fingers more than twice an hour. Then she cleaned the well thoroughly, removing dry leaves and mud from the bottom. She found some rusty buckets and tried to polish them as best she could. In that desert, water was her most. To feed herself, Elena shot rabbits with the rifle, amazed at how good she had become at aiming. She also gathered nopales and prickly pears from the nearby cacti, remembering what her grandmother had taught her about edible desert plants. There wasn't much, but it was enough. Every night before bed, she carefully swept the cabin, placed the heavy table against the door, and left the 2 loaded rifles by her side. Blackwell's men still hadn't returned, but Elena remained alert. On the 5th day, feeling more protected in her refuge, she decided to search the cabin more methodically. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't thoroughly inspected every corner. She started with the shelves, removing loose boards and tapping the walls looking for hollow spaces. She found nothing but frightened mice and more cobwebs. However, when she moved the old cot to clean it, she noticed something unusual. The floorboards under the cot made a different sound, hollower when stepped on. Elena knelt down and brushed her fingers over the worn wood. 3 planks seemed newer than the rest, less worn from continuous use. She inserted the tip of the knife. With Tomaz's knife in the crack, she pried, and the board lifted easily, revealing a dark compartment. Elena's heart raced. She carefully reached in, half expecting to encounter a snake. Her fingers brushed against something leather. She pulled and brought out a small leather pouch tied with a string. She opened it with trembling hands, and inside was a little leather-bound book with yellowed pages, a diary. Elena opened it to the first page. The handwriting was cramped but legible. Diary of Santiago Vargas, Valley of the Crosses, year 1871, Tomas's grandfather. Elena did some quick math. Santiago died in 1880, 98 years after starting this diary. She held nearly 10 years of entries in her hands. She sat by the window where the light was clearer and began to read. The first entries were trivial. Notes about work in the mine, discovered veins, concerns about supplies. But as she flipped through, the tone changed. 15031883. Today, Mr. Garrison's envoy came again to offer me $100 for my claim. I told him it was not for sale, and he left with threats, saying that Mr. Garrison always gets what he wants. I don't care. This land is mine by right. Elena felt a chill. That name seemed vaguely familiar. She continued reading. The entries grew darker. The 6th of February, 1883. They found Rodriguez dead in his mine, apparently from a cave-in. But I know the truth. Rodriguez refused to sell to Garrison last week. Now he is dead, and his widow, penniless, signed the papers. Garrison took over his mine, and I am afraid. On the night of the 20th of July, 1883, my wife Maria passed away. According to the doctor, it was from natural causes. However, she had been in good health 3 days earlier, right after she rejected a new proposal from Garrison. It doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. Elena's hands trembled as she flipped through the diary, and the story that emerged was chilling. A tycoon named Garrison methodically ruined small miners who refused to sell him their rights. Advantageous accidental events, sudden illnesses, unforeseen debts leading to confiscations, until Elena came across a passage that made her blood run cold. Date: the 5th of September, 1884. Today, the new banker, Cornelius Blackwell, Garrison's partner, showed up. He offered me a very favorable loan to modernize the mine. I declined. I know the drill well. They grant you credit, raise the interest rates, and seize your assets when you can't pay. I already saw how they did it to the Torres family the previous year. Today they are destitute, and Garrison owns their ranch. Elena dropped the diary. Blackwell was the same banker who had ruined her life. Either he worked for Garrison or collaborated with him. They had been committing these misdeeds for decades. With trembling hands, Elena continued reading. Santiago recorded everything. Lists of ruined families, dates of suspicious deaths, fraudulent land appropriations. It was a chronicle of systematic injustice. Toward the end of the notebook, Santiago wrote something different. The 10th of January, 1889. I feel unwell. I know I have little time left to live. Garrison is finally winning, but not as he thinks. I have hidden the most precious treasure in a place where he will never find it, under the center of the hearth, where the fire no longer warms. If any descendant of mine reads these lines in the future, they will know to search there and use what they find. They must use it to destroy those who caused the ruin of so many. Elena slowly closed the notebook. She remembered the phrase, under the center of the hearth, where the flame no longer warms. She looked inside the cabin. The only hearth was in a corner, a ring of rocks where she had made her first campfires. However, Santiago had written, where the fire no longer warms in the past tense. She stood up and went to the hearth, inspecting it carefully. The stones showed recent soot from her own fires. When she moved several loose rocks, she noticed something. Underneath there was another hearth, older and larger, completely hidden by the new one. Elena began removing the stones with increasing haste. Then the old hearth appeared, a ring of larger and flatter rocks. In the center lay a rock of different appearance, more square, placed intentionally. She pried it up and lifted it with difficulty. Beneath it opened a deep hole dug into the ground, and inside the hole, covered with waxed cloth, were several bundles. Elena extracted them one by one, her hands trembling so much she almost dropped them. She untied the first one. Papers, property deeds, agreements, bank statements, all signed by Garrison and Blackwell, and all showing clear fraud, manipulated dates, altered conditions, false seals. The second batch contained letters, correspondence between Garrison and Blackwell, where they openly discussed their machinations, direct evidence of conspiracy. The third package made Elena gasp. Nuggets of pure silver, dozens of them, each the size of her thumb. There was enough wealth to live comfortably for many years. At the bottom, in the end, lay a hand-drawn map of the mine, revealing tunnels deep into the mountain. With X marks where Santiago found rich veins of silver, the mine was not exhausted. It represented a fortune waiting to be exploited. Elena settled among the scattered treasures, her mind racing. Santiago had discovered silver, gathered evidence of Garrison and Blackwell's crimes, and then sealed the mine, pretending it was worthless. He had protected it until a descendant could use it. Tomas never knew. He died thinking his grandfather's mine had been a failure. Yet now, Elena knew the truth, and with it came an impossible choice. She could take the silver, flee far away, start an anonymous life. That would be the safest, the most rational, or use the evidence to ruin the men who had ruined Santiago and Tomas, as well as dozens of innocent families over decades. Fighting would be risky, probably lethal. A lone woman against powerful individuals with connections, money, and no morals. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. Elena carefully wrapped all the objects again and hid them under the floorboards. That night, while heating coffee over the fire, she heard something that chilled her blood. Several approaching voices. But those voices did not belong to Blackwell's men. They were different, rougher, more threatening. And one of them, clear in the night air, said, "Seal the mouth of the tunnel with dynamite. No one must know what's hidden here, especially that meddling widow." It was the voice of Cornelius Blackwell. Elena immediately smothered the fire, plunging the cabin into darkness. Her heart pounded as she slid toward the window, crouched under the frame. Outside, in the faint twilight, she made out 5 silhouettes. 3 carried rifles, 1 carried something heavy, and the 5th, even from a distance, was unmistakable. The expensive suit and wide-brimmed hat of Cornelius Blackwell. However, they were not heading toward the cabin. They were going straight to the mine entrance. Elena watched with growing dread as the man with the heavy load set it down near the sealed mouth. Even in the dim light, she could see the characteristic boxes. "Dynamite. Are you sure about this, Mr. Blackwell?" "If there's a secondary tunnel, as the map indicates," asked one of the men. "It could lead anywhere, that's why we're sealing it," Blackwell replied impatiently. "Old Santiago was cleverer than we thought. He found a major vein and hid it. But we can't allow anyone to find it, especially now that the widow is snooping around." "Why not just kill her?" asked another man casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Because a dead widow raises questions," Blackwell replied. "In contrast, a widow lost in the desert, perhaps a victim of Apaches or thirst, is just another sad misfortune." Elena felt bile rise in her throat. Those men were plotting her murder as if it were a trivial business matter. "Place the cartridges deep inside the entrance," Blackwell ordered. "I want that tunnel sealed forever." The men began to work. Elena knew she had minutes, maybe less. If they use all that dynamite to blow up the entrance, any evidence still inside will be destroyed forever. However, most importantly, according to Santiago's map that she had examined, there was an alternative tunnel connecting to the main mine. That tunnel had a natural exit at the other end of the mountain. If true, that passage could hold even more evidence, or silver, or even both. And Blackwell was about to seal everything. Elena made a split-second decision and left the cabin through the back door that led to the cliff. She moved through the increasingly deepening twilight with Santiago's map etched in her memory. According to the plan, the secondary entrance was about 500 meters to the east, hidden behind a rocky outcrop, and she started to run, crouched among the sagebrush and mesquite, her skirts catching on the thorns. She could still hear the voices of the men behind her, now fainter. She found the rocky outcrop exactly where the map indicated, and there, partially hidden by thorny bushes, a crevice opened in the mountain rock. It was barely wide enough for a slender person to pass through. Elena slipped through the crack, scraping her arms against the rough stone inside. She pulled the matches from her pocket and lit one. The flickering light revealed a narrow passage leading into the darkness. She had no flashlight, no rope, nothing but a handful of matches and a desperate will. She continued in the darkness, lighting matches occasionally to check her route. The tunnel gradually descended, with walls that narrowed and widened unpredictably. The air smelled of minerals and ancient dampness. After what seemed like hours, though surely it was only minutes, Elena emerged into a larger cave. She lit another match and gasped. There were boxes, dozens of U.S. Army wooden crates stacked against the walls. And in the center of the cave, a mine cart loaded with rock that gleamed silver even in the faint match light. Elena approached one of the military crates and pried open the lid with her fingers. Inside, she found gold, coins, bars, all stamped with the emblem of the United States Army. "Good heavens," she murmured. Santiago had uncovered a theft. She opened another crate, more gold, and beneath the gold, documents, military service records, and payroll transfer reports. The story became clear in Elena's mind as she reviewed the evidence. Garrison, before becoming a mining magnate, had been an army officer and had embezzled the troops' pay during the war. By hiding the gold here in a remote mine, Santiago had stumbled upon the stash. He documented everything, but never could reveal it because Garrison killed him first. And now Blackwell, Garrison's partner, was about to seal all the evidence forever. Elena was so focused reviewing the papers that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching through the main tunnel until it was too late. Well, the little widow turns out to be curious. Elena spun around. At the mouth of the main tunnel stood Blackwell, an oil lamp in his hand, and behind him 2 of his men armed with rifles. "I must admit I'm impressed," Blackwell continued, slowly approaching her. "You discovered the alternative tunnel, found the hiding place. You're sharper than your late husband." "You murdered Tomas," Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady, "and you also killed Tomas's grandfather and dozens of other people." Blackwell merely shrugged. "Business requires a certain elimination of competition." Her husband was stubborn. He kept digging in the San Rafael mine, getting too close to our operations. The collapse was tragic but necessary. Murderer? The businessman corrected Blackwell with a smile. "And now, Mrs. Vargas, I must choose. I can finish you right here, seal this passage, and no one will ever know. Or else," he paused dramatically, "you can choose to be sensible. Sensible option. Take one of these boxes of gold, walk away, start a different life, erase what you've witnessed here. We all benefit." Elena looked at the cave. The stolen precious metal, evidence of years of crimes, the countless victims who would never find justice. Elena replied simply. Blackwell's smile vanished. "Then you are as foolish as your husband." He gestured to his henchmen. "Finish her off, seal both entrances, and let's settle this once and for all." The men raised their weapons. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, ready to face the end. However, the roar that echoed in the cave did not come from the rifles of Blackwell's thugs. It came from the side passage through which Elena had entered. "Put down your weapons, U.S. Federal Marshal." Elena opened her eyes slightly. At the entrance of the tunnel, bathed in his flashlight's glow, stood a man of about 50 years. He wore a federal badge on his chest and held a rifle aimed at Blackwell. Behind the marshal followed 2 other individuals equipped with official insignias. "Cornelius Blackwell," the marshal declared firmly, "you are under arrest for theft of government property, murder, fraud, and conspiracy. And you, ma'am," he looked at Elena, "are safe now." Elena's knees gave way, and she fell to the cave floor, shaken by uncontrollable tremors. The moments that followed were a tumult. Blackwell's henchmen tried to resist, but they were outnumbered. The marshal, who identified himself as James Crawford, had arrived with reinforcements waiting outside. Blackwell was handcuffed as he shouted threats and demanded to see his lawyer. Once the situation calmed down, Marshal Crawford helped Elena to her feet. How did you find me?" she asked. "We didn't locate you. We've been tracking Garrison and Blackwell for 2 years. Payroll thefts during wartime, real estate fraud, and several murders, but we lacked solid evidence until today." He looked at the cave filled with crates. "This is exactly what we needed." "There's more," Elena added quickly, "in the hideout. Papers, agreements, letters, and my husband's grandfather recorded everything." Crawford nodded approvingly. "Then it seems we finally caught these men." Another silhouette emerged from the darkness of the hallway. An elderly woman of about 60, gray-haired, with eyes glistening with tears. "Did you find Santiago's notebook? The woman asked with a trembling voice. Elena, confused, nodded. Yes, but who? She asked. I am Magdalena Vargas, Santiago's sister, the woman replied. When my brother died, I knew he had been murdered. For years, I searched for proof. After trying to get someone to listen to me, 2 years ago, I contacted Marshall Crawford. We needed evidence, and now we have it, Crawford stated. Thanks to you, Mrs. Vargas. Elena watched Blackwell, handcuffed and defeated, as they led him out of the tunnel. Then she fixed her gaze on the evidence boxes, the stolen gold, and the documents that would prove decades of crimes. And what happens now? She asked. Now, Crawford replied, comes the hardest part. We must take this case to trial, and you, Mrs. Vargas, will be the main witness. Elena felt a chill of fear. Testifying meant being in the spotlight, facing powerful men in court, and becoming a target. However, looking at Magdalena, Elena saw in her eyes the pain of decades of unresolved injustice. She saw destroyed families, ruined lives, and all the silenced victims. I'll do it, Elena said. I'll testify. Crawford smiled. He knew she would agree. Let's get out of here. We have a lot of work ahead. As they went back through the tunnel towards the fresh night air, Elena realized something. The real battle had only just begun, and the following days were a whirlwind of activity. Marshal Crawford set up a camp near the mine, bringing in more federal agents to catalog and protect the evidence. Elena spent hours recounting everything she knew, everything she had found, and everything she had experienced. But she soon discovered that being taken seriously was a completely different struggle. On the third day, a local judge arrived from the nearby town of Silver Springs. He was a stout man named Horace Pemberton, with large mustaches and an air of exaggerated importance. Mrs. Vargas, he said, barely looking at her as he reviewed documents, I understand you have made certain accusations against Mr. Blackwell. They are not accusations, Elena replied firmly. They are documented facts. Judge Pemberton looked up, surprised by her tone. Madam, in complex legal matters like this, it is customary for a woman to have male representation. Do you have any relative or legal guardian who can speak on your behalf? I can speak for myself. Of course, Pemberton said condescendingly. But the law requires, let's say, certain formalities. Do you have a husband, a brother, a father? My husband died because of Blackwell. A pity, then perhaps a male lawyer who can present your testimony more appropriately. Marshal Crawford interjected. Judge Pemberton misses. Vargas's testimony is perfectly valid without intermediaries. Pemberton frowned. Marshal, with all due respect, this is a matter of local jurisdiction, and Mr. Blackwell is a respected citizen of Silver Springs. We cannot simply arrest him based on the word of an uneducated widow who found evidence of decades of fraud and murder, Crawford concluded coldly. If a conflict of jurisdiction arises, this case will be transferred directly to the federal court of Santa Fe. You must explain to the federal judge why you obstructed the investigation. Pemberton turned pale, though he maintained his stance. The story of a woman without support against powerful men requires considerable corroboration. Thus, the trend began. Every local authority that appeared found reasons to distrust. Every officer who knew Blackwell or Garrison expressed disbelief. No matter how accurate or well documented Elena's word was, it was always questioned simply because it came from a poor, unsupported woman. However, Elena did not remain alone for long. A week after the first arrests, more people began to arrive. The first was a woman named Carmen Ruiz, a widow like Elena, whose ranch had been confiscated by Blackwell 3 years earlier under questionable circumstances. Upon hearing that someone was finally standing up to that demon, commented Carmen, I couldn't help but come. I will testify if I can be of help. Then an old man, Jose Torres, arrived. His family had lost the coal mine due to a loan from Blackwell that mysteriously tripled in amount within months. They took everything from us, said Jose, with tears in his cracked eyes. My father died of grief. If there is justice, I want to be part of it. In the following weeks, more victims arrived. Workers from Garrison's mines who had been robbed of their wages arrived, as well as merchants who lost their businesses due to abusive tactics. Also arriving were Mexican families evicted from lands their ancestors had inhabited for generations. Magdalena, Santiago's sister, turned out to be a valuable ally. For years, she had recorded the crimes of Garrison and Blackwell, keeping files and quietly collecting testimonies from people who feared speaking publicly. But now, said Magdalena one night by the campfire, with the evidence you found, Elena, we can finally prove everything. Marshal Crawford organized everything, although even he faced restrictions. The problem, he explained one night, is that Garrison has strong political connections. Senators, governors, judges from Santa Fe, he is pressuring to have these charges dismissed. Can they do that? Asked Elena, terrified. They can try, which is why we need a case. So solid that they cannot ignore it. That's why Crawford looked at her intently. We need you ready to testify, Elena, not just about your discovery, but about Tomas, Santiago, everything. However, testifying would be only one of the threats Elena had to face. The first serious threat appeared one night as Elena returned from Silver Springs, where she had gone to buy supplies. 3 horsemen emerged from the brush and blocked the road. Elena recognized one of them, who had been among the miners the night of Blackwell's arrest. Mrs. Vargas, said the man in a dangerously calm tone, Mr. Blackwell sends greetings from prison and an offer. I want nothing from Blackwell. $5,000 in gold. You just need to forget what you witnessed, say you were confused, recant. Yes? The man sighed regretfully. Then Mr. Blackwell also sends this. He pulled out a folded paper and tossed it toward Elena. She took it with trembling hands and unfolded it. There were 3 photographs. One of Carmen Ruiz, another of Jose Torres, and one more of Magdalena. Accidents happen, the man commented. Horses get spooked, buildings catch fire, and people disappear. It would be horrible if her new friends suffered such misfortunes. Elena felt an icy fury replace her fear. Tell Blackwell he can threaten all he wants. I will not change my statement. Your funeral, ma'am. The riders left, leaving her trembling on the road. That night, Elena barely managed to sleep. The threats were real. Those people had killed before and would do so again. But the next day, when she shared the threats with the group, she found something unexpected: solidarity. Let them try, Carmen exclaimed fiercely. I've overcome worse things than hired thugs. We've all lost so much already, added Jose. What more can they take from us except our lives? And a life without justice is worth very little anyway. Magdalena hugged Elena. My child, my brother died for this cause. I am willing to die too, if necessary, but I prefer to live to see these demons in prison. Marshal Crawford reinforced the protection around the camp, but everyone knew he couldn't protect them completely, and the threats intensified. A week later, Carmen's cabin in Silver Springs went up in flames. She managed to escape, but lost everything she had. Jose was attacked on the road and brutally beaten. He survived, but one eye was permanently damaged. Elena herself was nearly ambushed on 2 occasions. Only the marshal's constant vigilance and her growing skill with the rifle kept her alive. But the hardest blow came when a young, idealistic lawyer from Santa Fe, Daniel Mora, who had offered to take the case for free, was found dead in his hotel. The local investigation classified it as suicide. No one who knew Daniel believed it. Elena was devastated. People are dying because of me, she wept that night. No, said Magdalena firmly. People are dying because Garrison and Blackwell are murderers. That blood is on their hands, not yours. But Daniel Mora's death brought something unexpected. Press attention. A journalist from Santa Fe, a man named William Hatchings, had been a friend of Daniel. Upon learning of the death ruled as suicide, he investigated, and what he found enraged him. Hatchings arrived at the camp 2 days after Daniel's funeral. "I want to write about this," he said bluntly. "I want to expose the entire Garrison and Blackwell operation. Would you allow me to interview them?" Crawford was skeptical. "Publicity could put everyone in greater danger," said Crawford. "It could also protect them," replied Hatchings. "It's hard to make people disappear quietly when the whole territory is reading about them in the newspapers." He was not mistaken. In the following weeks, Hatchings published a series of devastating articles. The account of the terror in New Mexico became required reading throughout the Southwest. The details he spread, the names of victims he revealed, and the evidence he mentioned generated immense social pressure. From his mansion in Santa Fe, Garrison attempted a defamation lawsuit, but Hatchings had solid documentation for every statement. Eventually, the pressure became unbearable. The territorial governor, concerned for his own prestige, ordered that the case go to federal trial immediately. "We've done it," Crawford said one night, holding the official telegram. "The trial will be in Santa Fe in 6 weeks with an impartial federal judge." But Elena understood that the real battle was just beginning. Testifying before the court, facing expert lawyers, and holding her ground under relentless cross-examination awaited her. Garrison and Blackwell had 6 weeks to ensure she didn't reach that point alive. The journey to Santa Fe was an armed procession. Marshal Crawford took no chances. He escorted Elena and the other witnesses with 6 federal agents. They traveled by night, constantly changing routes and sleeping in shifts. Elena spent those nights under the starry desert sky, psychologically preparing for what was to come. Crawford had warned her. Garrison's lawyers would be ruthless. They would try to destroy her credibility, painting her as a confused and vengeful liar. "Don't give them ammunition," Crawford told her. "Keep your answers brief, just facts. Don't let yourself be provoked." When they finally arrived in Santa Fe, the city buzzed with anticipation. Hatchings's articles had turned the case into a territorial phenomenon. The streets filled with signs. Some supported the victims. Others defended Garrison as a local benefactor unfairly accused. The lawyer who agreed to represent the case was a man named Abraham Levinson. He was a Jew from New York who had built his career defending the dispossessed against corporations. He was small, with a soft voice, but eyes that sparkled with sharp intelligence. "Mrs. Vargas," he said in their first meeting, "your testimony will be crucial, but I must warn you, the defense will try to discredit you by any means possible. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes, I am," Elena replied, with more confidence than she truly felt. The days leading up to the trial were intense. Levinson trained her relentlessly, asking difficult questions, pointing out weaknesses in her story, and teaching her to breathe when she felt panic. But there were also moments of unexpected support. Carmen, Jose, Magdalena, and dozens of other victims gathered each night, sharing stories and strengthening their collective resolve. William Hatchings kept writing, now covering every new development in the case. His article, "The Widow Who Defied an Empire," turned Elena into a public figure, which was both protection and danger. 3 days before the trial, the final threat arrived. Elena was in her hotel room, reviewing documents, when someone slid an envelope under the door. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph of her taken through the window of her room. A red circle encircled her head, and a message written in elegant handwriting read, "Last chance, $10,000, a train ticket to California, a new life, or a grave in the desert. Decide before dawn." Elena felt a chilling terror because they knew where she was and could reach her at any moment. For an instant, just an instant, she weighed the proposal. 10,000 euros was a sum greater than she could ever earn in her entire existence. She could vanish, restart her life erase this nightmare completely. However, upon seeing the papers scattered on her bed, she distinguished the names of the victims, dozens of them. Shattered homes, ruined lives, deceased. In the list of victims compiled by Levinson, she recognized the name Tomas and also Santiago Vargas. Elena tore the letter into tiny pieces, threw them into the chamber pot, and set them on fire. Minutes later, alerted by the guards, Crawford arrived and found Elena calmly sitting, staring at the charred remains. "They tried to bribe you," Crawford commented, without forming a question. "That's right, and may they burn in hell." Crawford gave a faint smile and said, "That's the spirit." However, that night, Elena barely slept a wink. As Garrison's henchmen had shown her, they were able to reach her. What prevented them from simply killing her before the trial? The answer came unexpectedly the next morning. Elena went down for breakfast and found the hotel dining room packed with people. They were not ordinary guests. They were the victims. All the families ruined by Garrison and Blackwell. All those people who, out of fear, had not dared to report, had gathered in Santa Fe. Dozens of them packed both the hotel and the streets, forming a presence impossible to ignore or silence. "If they kill you," Carmen said simply, "any one of us can testify. There are so many of us that they cannot silence us all," added Jose. "You are no longer alone, Elena, nor will you ever be." However, the most severe blow came that afternoon. Magdalena, who had gone to buy groceries, did not return in time for dinner. Her body was found in an alley 3 hours later, with multiple stab wounds and the documents about Santiago stolen. Elena collapsed upon hearing the news. That woman, who had devoted years to pursuing justice for her brother, had been murdered just steps away from the trial that could finally deliver justice. "It's all my fault. It's me, Elena. If you had never discovered that evidence," Crawford interrupted, "Magdalena would have died anyway in time, when she ceased to be useful to them. At least now her death will have a purpose, to finish them off." Magdalena's funeral was held the next day, intimate and rushed, but attended by those who knew her. Elena delivered the eulogy, her voice trembling. "Magdalena devoted 20 years to the search for justice. She did not find it while alive, but I swear before all of you that she will witness it in her death. These men will be held accountable, I swear." On the eve of the trial, Elena was unable to fall asleep. She settled by the window, watching the dark streets of Santa Fe. Reflecting on all that had already been lost and what she could still lose, she recalled Tomas, killed in a premeditated collapse. She remembered Santiago, poisoned for protecting his territory, and Magdalena, stabbed in an alley. She remembered Daniel Mora, the young lawyer who committed suicide, and the dozens of other victims whose names she barely remembered, but whose existence had been just as real, just as precious. And she reflected on the woman she had been just a few months earlier, fearful and dependent, convinced that she was not capable of standing on her own. That woman had perished in the desert, but the one who remained was another, more resilient, stronger, more determined. With the first rays of the sun, Elena dressed carefully, borrowed a dress suitable for Carmen's court, more sophisticated than any garment she had ever owned. She adjusted her hair and looked at herself in the mirror. "This is for all of them," she murmured to her reflection. "You won't let them down." Crawford came to get her an hour before the trial began. "Ready?" he asked. Elena took a deep breath. "Ready." They walked together toward the federal courthouse through streets full of onlookers. Some applauded, others whistled. Everyone was eager to meet the widow who had stood up to an empire. As she crossed the courthouse door, Elena saw James Garrison face to face for the first time. A man of 60, still robust, with perfectly combed gray hair, and a suit that surely cost more than the ranch he had taken from Elena. Their eyes met for a moment. Garrison's eyes were cold, calculating, utterly ruthless, Elena held his gaze without blinking. Blackwell was also present with his partner, with an air less confident than Garrison's, but equally arrogant. The courtroom filled quickly. The judge, one Nathaniel Carswell, made his entrance. He was famous for being stern but impartial, with no clear ties to either side. Court is in session, the bailiff announced, and thus began the contest that would define everything. The trial against James Garrison and Cornelius Blackwell became the most media-driven event New Mexico had witnessed in decades. The room was so packed that people were crammed into the hallways, and outside there were crowds listening to secondhand reports. The prosecutor, in collaboration with Abraham Levinson, began with a devastating summary of the crimes. Decades of fraud, extortion, homicide, appropriation of federal property. The evidence they showed was conclusive. The Army's gold chests, the forged documents, the letters between the conspirators. Next, the initial testimonies. Marshal Crawford explained how he had tracked Garrison for years. A document expert proved the alterations in the contracts. A retired Army officer identified the gold stolen from the 1,878 payroll. But the defense, led by a famous lawyer from Washington named Thaddeus Morton, counterattacked cunningly. They challenged every document, proposed alternative versions, sowed uncertainty. On the second day, they called Elena to the stand, and she walked forward with trembling legs. Nevertheless, with her head held high, she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Levinson began the questioning with gentle questions, establishing who Elena was, how she had lost Tomas, how she had come to the mine. "Mrs. Vargas," said Levinson, "can you tell us what you found in the hut of the deceased Santiago Vargas?" Elena inhaled deeply and began to recount. She spoke for almost an hour. Santiago's diary, the notes about Garrison and Blackwell, the hiding place under the hearth, the papers that proved the fraud. Her voice was clear and firm. When she finished, the silence was absolute in the room. Then came the cross-examination. Thaddeus Morton stood up slowly, adjusting his vest. He was a large, imposing man with a thunderous voice designed to intimidate Mrs. Vargas. He began in a honeyed tone. "Is it true that you cannot read or write?" "I can read and write," Elena replied firmly. "Ah, excuse me, how many years of formal education did you have?" 4 years at the mission school. 4 years. Fascinating. And yet, you expect this court to accept that with only 4 years of education, you managed to decipher complicated legal documents, banking agreements, coded messages. The documents were not ambiguous. Any literate person could understand them. Morton gave a smug smile. "Mrs. Vargas, isn't it true that you were desperate, without funds, without a roof, without any hope?" "I admit I was going through difficult times, and it is false that my client, Mr. Blackwell, is innocent. He offered me assistance, a feasible plan to settle my debt. What he offered me was to take my property." "Objection!" Morton raised his voice. "The characterization stands," replied Judge Carswell. "Mrs. Vargas, stick to the facts," Morton continued. "It seems unlikely, Mrs. Vargas, that in the midst of your distress and mourning for your husband's death, you took ordinary documents as evidence of a conspiracy. I did not misinterpret them. It is not credible that your grief, your legitimate anger against those who failed to rescue your husband, clouded your reason. My husband did not die by chance. He was murdered." "Objection, that is unfounded. There is all the necessary evidence." Elena leaned forward, raising her voice despite Levinson's attempts to calm her. The collapse at the San Rafael mine was because the wooden supports were deliberately weakened. There are witnesses who saw Garrison's employees near the mine the day before. Mrs. Vargas, Judge Carswell, bang the table, answer only what is asked of you. Morton was now smiling, satisfied with having annoyed her. "Mrs. Vargas, Isn't it true that you have obtained notable media coverage and that the newspaper has called you a heroine? I did not seek that attention, but you have enjoyed it, haven't you? A destitute widow who suddenly becomes famous, revered. Isn't it tempting to exaggerate the facts to preserve that veneration? I am not falsifying any facts. Isn't it true that you would obtain enormous benefits if my client were found guilty, that you could appropriate valuable assets and become rich? I do not seek fortune. I only seek justice. Justice, repeated Morton in a sarcastic tone. A lofty term, but let's be honest, Mrs. Vargas. You lack education, financial means, and tolerance for my offenses. Elena cut him off with a voice as firm as metal. You may question my education level, my status, my gender, but you cannot change reality. Your client is a thief and a murderer. The papers, the stolen gold, and the corpses prove it. And no matter how many rhetorical flourishes you use, that will not change. The room filled with whispers. Magistrate Carswell repeatedly banged his gavel, exclaiming, "Order!" For the first time, Morton appeared disconcerted. He asked several additional questions, trying to regain control, but Elena answered each with renewed serenity. At the end of the interrogation, Elena stepped down from the witness stand. As she returned to her seat, something surprising happened. A woman in the public gallery stood up and began to applaud, then another and another. Within seconds, half the room was on their feet cheering Elena while the bailiffs called for silence. Elena sat down trembling, tears streaming down her face. The following days brought more testimony. Carmen Ruse recounted how Blackwell, he had an unexpected witness appeared, a former secretary of Garrison who had kept copies of incriminating correspondence for years, waiting for the right moment to speak. Her testimony was devastating, but the defense also presented witnesses, respectable businessmen who claimed Garrison was a pillar of the community, local officials who certified that all procedures were legal. The critical moment came when the defense attempted to create reasonable doubt about the origin of the military gold. It is not possible, Morton argued, that Santiago Vargas himself stole that gold during the war and hid it, and that my client simply discovered the hiding place years later. It was a clever theory that could generate enough doubt for a verdict of not guilty. But Levinson had a final revelation. He presented military service records showing that Santiago had never been near the payroll routes, that Garrison, however, had been a logistics officer with direct access to the gold shipments. And then the final blow, a witness that no one expected, a man of nearly 80 years, a former soldier who had served under Garrison. I saw Lieutenant Garrison divert 3 payroll shipments in 1878, the old man declared with a trembling voice. He threatened to kill me if I said anything. I have lived with that guilt for 40 years, but I am not going to die without telling the truth. The old soldier's testimony destroyed Garrison's last defense. The closing arguments were brief, and Levinson summarized the evidence methodically. Morton appealed to emotion, painting Garrison as a victim of a conspiracy, but everyone in the courtroom knew how it would end. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, their spokesperson was pale but firm. In the case of the territory of New Mexico versus James Garrison, he read, "We find the defendant guilty of theft of federal property, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and first-degree murder." Garrison remained motionless, his face a stone mask. In the case against Cornelius Blackwell, we find the defendant guilty of fraud, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and first-degree murder. Blackwell collapsed in his chair, all arrogance gone from him. Judge Carswell immediately handed down the sentences, life imprisonment for both, without possibility of parole. Furthermore, all their assets would be confiscated and distributed among their victims. When the gavel fell for the last time, Elena closed her eyes. Finally, the weight of months of horror, suffering, and battle lifted from her shoulders. Outside the courthouse, Numerous victims surrounded her amidst tears, laughter, and hugs, along with Magdalena's children who had come to hear the verdict. William Hutchins approached with his notebook ready. "Mrs. Vargas, how are you?" Elena pondered for a moment. "I feel like I can finally breathe." That night, a spontaneous party was organized at the hotel. It wasn't triumphant, as the price paid had been very high. Yet, there was a sense of relief, serenity, and, after so many years, justice at last. Elena went to rest early, completely exhausted. In her room, she stood by the window, watching the distant mountains bathed in moonlight. "We did it, Tomas," she murmured to the wind. "We did it, Santiago. Rest peacefully." After several months, Elena managed to sleep a whole night without distressing dreams. 3 months later, she returned to the Valle de las Cruces. It was already spring, and the desert that had once been arid and hostile was now filled with hues. The slopes were carpeted with yellow and purple wildflowers, and the mesquites showed sprouts of green and tender leaves. The hut that had once been her emergency shelter had become her voluntary residence. Over the weeks in Santa Fe, while the lawyers managed the distribution of the confiscated assets, Elena had already decided how to steer her future. Santiago's mind, now free of litigation and fully hers, had silver veins capable of enriching Elena many times over. However, she did not crave excessive wealth. She wanted something different. Elena hired honest workers from Silver Springs, the ones that Garrison and Blackwell had exploited, and offered them fair wages and a share of the profits. The mining operation began to function according to values Santiago would have supported: respect, honesty, and fair distribution. Carmen Ruiz, after recovering her ranch that had been seized, chose to sell it and moved to live near Elena. "Two widows are stronger than one," she commented, smiling. She set up a modest textile business, offering blankets and clothing to the mine employees. Jose Torres arrived with his family to take charge of the grocery store that Elena founded next to the mining settlement. Elena's grandchildren ran around among the newly built structures, and their laughter filled a place that for many years had only experienced silence. The primitive hut was gradually expanded. Elena added rooms, completely repaired the roof, and installed real windows. However, she preserved Santiago's original hearth, now cleaned and renovated, to serve as a reminder of how it all began. The papers and letters that had defeated Garrison and Blackwell were donated to the Territorial Museum of Santa Fe, where William Hutchins cataloged them himself. They became historical evidence of a dark but important period in the history of New Mexico. Elena's transformation was even more remarkable. The fragile lady who had fled to the desert a few months ago was almost forgotten. Now, she rode through the valley confidently, overseeing mining activities, making deals, and resolving matters that impacted dozens of people. Those hands that once had only done household chores now used mining tools, rifles, and account books with equal skill. Her face, tanned by the harsh sun, showed lines of determination that she previously lacked. However, beyond the physical changes, what was truly relevant was her internal metamorphosis. Elena no longer identified herself as Tomas's widow or as any man's woman. Now she was Elena Vargas, mine owner, community leader, and protector of those who suffered abuse. Her legal case had spurred reforms that transcended her own existence. The lawsuit revealed such widespread corruption that the territorial government established new regulations to protect small landowners from banking scams. The laws regarding loan contracts were amended, and foreclosure processes were revised to prevent injustices. In particular, widows obtained new legal safeguards. Their assets could no longer be automatically taken away simply because they lacked a male guardian. They were empowered to sign agreements, own land, and testify in court with the same authority as men. These were not ideal transformations. Society did not change in an instant, but they were a beginning. 6 months after the trial, one afternoon, Elena was at the doorway of her expanded home, reviewing accounting records. Just then, a horse-drawn carriage approached. It looked refined no doubt belonging to a wealthy person. A young woman of about 20 years descended from the vehicle, dressed in a functional yet well-made traveling outfit. Behind her, an elderly gentleman alighted who appeared to be her father. "Mrs. Vargas," the girl asked timidly. "Yes, my name is Sarah Pemberton, my father and I. You see, we learned of your story from the press, about what you accomplished." The young woman paused, gathering courage. "My father passed away a year ago. The bank intends to take our estate, claiming that my father's obligations now fall on me. However, the numbers don't add up. I suspect they are carrying out a deception, similar to the one you suffered." Elena stood up slowly, studying the young woman. She saw her own fear reflected in her, the anguish of feeling trapped in a scheme designed to destroy her. "Have you brought the papers?" Elena asked. Sarah nodded and pulled out a pile of documents. Elena examined them carefully, for her eyes were now trained to spot irregularities that previously would have gone unnoticed. There, the same strategies were repeated. Exorbitant interest rates, clauses altered after signing, the usual pattern of fraud. "You are right," Elena finally concluded. "This is a scam, and we are going to fight it." "We?" Sarah blinked in surprise. "You are not alone," Elena stated firmly. "I cannot tolerate women being ruined by dishonest bankers while I have the ability to prevent it." In the following months, Elena used her influence and resources to support Sarah. She hired lawyers, gathered evidence, pressured the institution till they gave in and canceled the fraudulent debt. However, she did not stop there. She founded a cooperative for widows and single women, providing loans without exorbitant interest rates, legal guidance, and collective support. Carmen and other women who had suffered similar grievances joined as managers. This cooperative became an example for similar entities throughout the country. William Hatchins wrote numerous articles about it, and soon other towns began to establish their own replicas. A year after the trial, Elena stood at the mine entrance at sunset. She watched as the sun sank behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. She had lost everything: spouse, home, stability. Yet, rising from the ruins, she found something that no one could take from her: the conviction that she could overcome any adversity. The system had been designed so that women like her would be defeated, but by refusing to accept that defeat, she not only rescued herself, but changed the rules for all who came after. Behind her, she heard murmurs. Carmen joking with Jose about something. There were children playing near the store, workers exchanging greetings after a day at the mine. This place, once desolate and abandoned, now buzzed with life and community. Elena remembered Tomas, Santiago, Magdalena, all those victims who did not survive to see justice. Nevertheless, her legacy endured in this valley, in these people, in the norms that had been transformed. A light breeze stirred her hair, and Elena half closed her eyelids, inhaling the desert air that no longer smelled of anguish, but of hope. "Thank you," she murmured to the wind, in memory of all those who had fought before her. "From this point, I will continue my path." When she opened her eyes again, the sun had already set completely, and the first stars were beginning to shine in the velvet firmament. Elena walked back to the cabin, heading towards the warm lights and the voices of her community.